God saw fit to make his one and only Son, Jesus Christ, a preacher. Preaching has a vital role in the life of Adoration Bible Church. I want to look at a passage with you from 2 Timothy chapter 4. Paul writes these words to Timothy. I charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead by his appearing in his kingdom. Preach the word. I'd like to make three observations about this text. First, Paul gives his charge to young Timothy to preach in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus. I know that this is referring primarily to God's and Christ's authority, but also I take this secondarily to mean that the primary place preaching is to be done is where God dwells, namely in and among his people, which when gathered we call the church. This answers the question, why must we have preaching when we gather? Martin Luther said, where the authentic preaching of the word takes place, the church is there. Friends, preaching belongs in the church. Number two, Paul lays out the reality that preaching is aimed at. He says it's Christ who is the judge of the living and the dead, and by his appearing in his kingdom. Paul sets for Timothy as a backdrop for his charge to preach the reality of Christ as the judge of all men. As if to say to Timothy, preach to prepare people to face that day, to face that reality. And he sets forth Christ's eternal kingdom as if to say, Timothy, preach in such a way as to prepare your people to live and have their joy in that kingdom. This urgency is so needed in preaching today. Biblical preaching must be done with these ultimate realities in view. Eternity hangs in the balance. So much preaching today seems to have nothing in view other than the upcoming week. And this sort of preaching does terrible harm to God's people and violates the apostles' vision for the purpose of preaching. The third point I would make is that we see Paul telling Timothy not just to preach, but to preach the word. This should have been obvious to Timothy just as it should be obvious to us. But in Timothy's day, just like in our day, we have men preaching myths, fables, strange doctrines that do not produce maturity, do not make men wise for salvation, and do not equip for ministry. This is why we must have the Bible at the center of our preaching, and our commitment to expositional preaching is how we make sure that it does. More could be said, but let's just end by stating the three things we observe from the text. First, that preaching has a place in the church. Secondly, that preaching must be aimed at the ultimate eternal realities that God says await all of us. And third, that preaching must be rooted in a commitment to preach the truth of the Bible. To learn how you can pray, give, or be a part of this new church plant in Schenectady, New York, visit us at adorationbible.church.